Hey, it's Silver, and this is Hunt the Knight. So, Hunt the Knight is a hardcore action RPG set in a very unpleasant dark fantasy world where the knight is this horrible eldritch thing where terrible stuff happens every night and murders all of humanity. You are part of an organization called Stalkers that actually don't go into the Chernobyl exclusion zone, but instead are focused on fighting the knight with the knight. Basically, they're people with knight powers that use them to keep the horrible night creatures at bay. And the backstory of the game has this seal in place that basically causes a permanent artificial daytime to keep the night at bay, but it came at quite a high cost and has now been broken. And there's a lot of night to catch up on now, so there's pretty much permanent murderous night happening, and you are Vesper, a character who is, of course, a member of this organization and has some pretty nasty ties to a certain traitor, and the idea is that you gotta figure out what to do. You gotta try and get this seal back online, and you've also gotta figure out whether or not the cost is actually worth paying, and whether or not your father was actually a traitor or what he knew and all that stuff. So it is definitely a very grim dark fantasy world with a lot of death and a lot of blood. You are armed with a couple of important things. First off, you do have a weapon, and there are lots of weapons for you to find in-game, mostly in between long swords, great swords, spears, daggers, and gauntlets, and a couple of other things. There are various kinds of them that you'll come across, all with, of course, different damage values, and some of them have the ability to poison enemies, some of them have the hemokinesis stat, which allows you to have a chance at healing whenever you kill things, and some things of that nature. You also have dark powers, because, of course, you are a stalker, so you have some dark magic at your disposal. This is all cooldown based. You can only equip one of them at a time, but they are extremely powerful. Of course, their cooldowns tend to be very long, but like I said, they're super effective, so it's always nice to have them. You don't find these very often in the world, not as often as things like weapons, but they are always a wonderful thing to come across when you do find them because of how powerful and unique they are. You also have guns, 3 different guns in fact. You have a pistol, a crossbow, and a shotgun, each one taking a different number of bullets. You'll see that sort of 6-chamber revolver cylinder on the HUD, that represents your bullets, and you actually have effectively infinite ammo, but you have to recharge it by dealing damage to enemies with your main weapon. This is a pretty cool idea because it allows you to use your guns very often, and as long as you're efficient in your melee combat, doing lots of good dodges and then laying into enemies when they're vulnerable and then dodging back away, you're doing a lot of diving like that. As long as you keep that up, you'll have a nice supply of bullets available. You also have that purple gauge off the side there. That's your shadow gauge, which isn't generally used for your night powers, interestingly enough, but instead it's used mostly for your dodge and for the ability to project a sort of shadow self forward, which is not combat related. This is something you use for exploration. It allows you to pass over terrain that you otherwise would get hurt or couldn't pass yourself. But your dodge, of course, is combat related, and it is the classic forward dash with immunity frames, so it's very useful in combat. You can dash straight through enemies, dash through projectiles, through attacks, everything, although you do have to, of course, get used to the fact that it seems to be 8-directional, I think. So if you're moving kind of at an angle that isn't one of like the sort of 45-degree 8-directional angles, you'll kind of snap to the nearest one, a bit like playing Dark Souls 2. As you kill enemies, you'll obtain a resource called Noctilium. This is your currency. You can bring it back to the hub area. You have a base where all these stalkers rest. It actually takes a little minute to get to it because at first it's a dungeon. It's actually the first dungeon of the game that you have to clear with 2 pretty difficult bosses. But once you do clear it, it becomes your main base, and you can return to it to spend this Noctilium on a couple of different things. You can upgrade your gear, which gives you unlockable upgrades for all of your weapons. Each of your 3 weapons has 3 individual upgrades that can apply to them, and you can apply them individually, so 1 for each weapon. You can select whichever ones that you think would be good for the current situation. So you could have explosive crossbow bolts, or a shotgun with like twice the range, or a pistol that poisons people, some other stuff like that. There's also a merchant in the main hub that allows you to spend this on some new weapons, some new armors, and some runes, which are passive effects. They're kind of like rings from Dark Souls. Honestly, that's sort of the vibe they're going for. You can only equip one of them at a time, but they tend to be pretty significant effects. There are runes that do things like giving all of your attacks the ability to poison, and by the way, poison in this game is extremely strong. All damage over time is very powerful, in fact, so it's something that you want to use whenever you can. Some of them also drastically increase the power of a specific firearm, so if you find yourself using one of them in particular, you might want to equip its rune. And there's even a covetous Silver Serpent ring one that gives you more Noctilium on kill. You can also spend it with the gardener lady because she grows roses, and roses are actually your healing item. They are a charge-based healing item, meaning they're not consumable, you don't farm them. Once you run out, whenever you die or return to one of the statues, the crow statues that act as checkpoints, they will refill, so you'll always have your maximum amount when you revive, and you can spend some money to increase that maximum amount. You can also eventually find some seeds for these special stellar roses that are a very pretty purple color instead of the red ones, and they actually heal you like drastically more than the red ones, so you definitely want to get those seeds when you can. So yeah, in terms of your overall skill set, there's quite a bit of stuff to find and do. This means there's a good amount of build variety, even though you are, of course, always playing as the same character with the same 3 range weapons and stuff. You still have quite a bit of choice in terms of what main weapon you're equipping, what upgrades for your range weapons you're equipping, what runes you're equipping, what dark powers you're using, all that stuff. So yeah, I would say the build variety is actually not bad. But in terms of exploration, the game very much shines here because the world is actually pretty large. There's a lot to explore, and notably, the dungeons are huge in this game. You have some kind of like a Zelda style of open world where you've got a lot of places to go, but many of them are blocked off behind certain items or abilities that you won't have at first. So you can only explore certain dungeons in a certain order, and then you'll get some sort of item near the end of that dungeon that will allow you to open up more of the map and find more dungeons. And yeah, the dungeons are huge. Sometimes they even have more than one boss in them because they're so big. Combat is pretty challenging in this game. It is pretty exacting. You take a lot of damage when you get hit. There are some enemies that can like 2 or 3 shot you from full health, so you got to be careful about those. And of course, all of this encourages you to explore the world more, to find all sorts of alternate routes and secrets and hidden things, because there's actually a lot of secret stuff in this game, a lot of optional stuff that really helps you out. You'll sometimes find these caves with roses growing outside of them. They have a chalice inside that you can drink from that permanently increases your maximum health, which is mega useful. You've also got these hunts that you can do. You can actually go to a sort of bar in the hub area and choose to pay some Noctilium to engage some hunts, and you'll find these sort of reddish golden eyes in walls and stuff, oftentimes in relatively hidden or more difficult to get to parts of the world, and if you've paid for that particular hunt, then that eye will open up into a sort of mini dungeon, allowing you to defeat a much more difficult version of a standard enemy that often has a lot of other spawns of more standard enemies and stuff in it. But if you're able to defeat this more difficult enemy, not only will you get a good amount of Noctilium back, but you'll also get one of these vials that increases your maximum health or your shadow gauge, so that you can slowly build yourself up to be a little tankier, a little stronger as you explore the world. And the high difficulty of the combat very much pushes you to do more exploration, right? Because you want to find this stuff. You want to find stuff to make you stronger. You want to get more Noctilium for more upgrades. You want to find new weapons. There are also some other things to find, more lore relevant things to find aside from just upgrades. You can find these feathers, and these are basically the dying words of other stalkers. So the feathers are like your lore documents that you can find and read at your own pace. There's also some other papers and notes and things that you can find and read, but these feathers are your main source of like background lore and story information. And in fact, they're actually like absolutely full of really good lore, and they're really well written and very fun to read. I recommend finding as many of them as you can. If you're the kind of player like me that's really into the lore of games like this, then they are a really good source because they have some pretty cool stories to tell. The boss fights in this game are very impressive. They are huge oftentimes, they take up like the whole screen, and usually they have a lot of different mechanics in multiple phases, and the ones that don't tend to have multiple phases usually have a lot more mechanics up front to make up for that. They're often very unpleasant looking and have some pretty crazy attack patterns and things for you to learn. Some of them go like full on bullet hell, while others are more melee centric or have some other like almost raid like terrain manipulation and stuff that you've got to look out for. There's definitely a lot of creativity in the overall enemy and boss designs. The enemies are uniquely unpleasant looking oftentimes, the creatures of the night, and there are many different ones for you to face, but it's really the bosses where the game shines in terms of the creativity of its designs as well as the creativity of its encounter design, as in like, you know, how fun it is to fight, how many attacks it has, what you need to learn in order to beat it. I've only beat one boss so far in this game on my first try. All the others have taken me at least 2 or 3, some of them more than that, like 6, because the combat does definitely get pretty difficult, and like I said, since the bosses are often really involved with a lot of mechanics to learn in multiple phases and stuff, they are definitely quite challenging. So if you are wanting a challenging 2D RPG, this is definitely up your alley. It is hard, but so far I've found the difficulty to be fair for the most part. I haven't really encountered something that I thought was like super cheap or obnoxious obnoxious. I think there are some enemies that have odd hitboxes and a couple of their attacks, hitboxes that are oddly tall, things that hit above them more than they actually should, but I also think that those are relatively rare, and they also aren't any of the main, like, difficult enemies, so I don't think that it's much of a contributor to the game's overall difficulty. The story is told in kind of an unusual way because your character doesn't talk normally. She is effectively mute. The other characters do talk, and they have a lot to say, and of course you have all the lore documents and feathers and things as well, but your character does actually talk in her inner world. She can actually go to this sort of inner self version of events and talk with her inner darkness, who is not very nice. And in these inner self scenes, your character Vesper does actually speak. So this basically means that the story externally is told through the events of the NPCs around you and through their dying words and stuff like that, whereas, and of course shown to you visually by what the bosses are doing, and the story internally is like you get her internal monologue effectively. One thing this game tends to do in its dungeons that I really like is it introduces the boss early. Pretty much all of the dungeons will have the boss of that area hound you throughout the dungeon itself. You won't just meet them for the first time in their boss room. They will have chased you, they will have tried to attack you, they will have tried to ambush you, they will have done various things to make your life miserable throughout the dungeon, which makes it extra interesting to actually encounter the full being finally and actually fight it. Overall, I'd say this is a really solid action RPG. It may have some dissonant hitbox issues here and there, and some people may be turned off by the difficulty, but I think overall it is a pretty fair game with an interesting story and a really nice dark fantasy gross art style that I quite like, the sort of pixely gore and stuff like that. I think it fits a universe like this, right? It makes sense. The crazy looking night creatures and stuff, along with the very good music, by the way, give it a very specific atmosphere. And in fact, there are certain elements of this game where it goes like full-on horror game at you kind of unexpectedly. Like, for instance, the manor area where it like almost turns into Resident Evil, complete with like jump scares and scare chords and stuff that you wouldn't necessarily expect, and this big horrible moment where the boss surprises you for the first time. So because of its pretty enjoyable combat and its really nice aesthetics and really fun bosses and stuff, it makes for a pretty memorable action RPG. So pretty easy to recommend at its price, I would say. You get a good amount of playtime out of it, and that playtime is, for the most part, fair and interesting and not a bunch of grinding or backtracking or anything like that. So that is Hunt the Night. I will, as always, put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for the game so that you can go and check it out yourself if you are so inclined. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.